Hello, Dr. Jones again, this time to teach you about the tricky concept of standard deviations. Now, there's a lot that you could learn about standard deviations, and I can't cover it all in this short introductory video. What I do want to cover is some basics and some things that come up from time to time on the AP exam, especially one little thing that the way they word it can be a little bit tricky at times, and so I want to make sure you understand a key distinction about standard deviations. So let's start by reviewing what is a standard deviation. Well, as you can see from the study guide, it's the measure of variability of scores around a mean. Now, what does that even mean? Well, what it means is you get a data, and you take that data and you plug it into a formula. And you don't have to know the formula for this class, but you do need to know how to interpret it. And out comes a number. And that number, that standard deviation, helps us understand a large data set. So let me pull up a bell curve to show you what I mean. Okay, so here's our bell curve. Now this works best if I can explain it with an example. So let's say that you and your classmates took an AP psychology test, and your teacher comes back and says that it fit into a standard, he did the standard deviations, and it was a standard bell curve. All right, and this is the standard bell curve. Now there's different types of bell curves, but for right now, we're just gonna stick with the standard bell curve. All right, and they told you that the mean, the average score on that exam was an 80%. All right, so let's pretend like you are that average, and it's not letting me put that in there. All right, so there we go. There's that 80% right there. All right, so now you are the mean. What else does that tell us? Well, if you are the mean on a standard curve, if you'll notice that line right down the middle also makes the curve symmetrical. So if you score the average score, it means you're dead center. You are the median of that population. So half your classmates scored worse than you, half your classmates scored better. So if the teacher lined you up, and I hope they would never do this, but if they lined you up from the student who had the worst score all the way to the student who had the best score, you'd be standing right in the middle. Now, let's say you talk to one of your friends, and your friend says, oh, the teacher told me I scored one standard deviation above the mean. All right, so here's +1, also known as the z-score. So your friend would be right on this line here. And so I'm just going to put a little dot here. That's your friend. So they're one standard deviation above. And then you talk to another friend and they said, oh, I was one standard deviation below. So what does that mean? Well, again, if we were lined up from the student who scored the worst to the student who scored the best, you would be right in the middle. And then your friends on either side of you, about 2/3 of the class would be between those two friends. Actually, it's a little more than 2/3. If you look here, it's 68%. So in a standard deviation, 68% of the population falls within one standard deviation. So sometimes on the AP exam, they'll ask, what percentage of the population scored within one standard deviation of the mean? And that's going to be a 68%. But what does that really tell us? Well, if the standard deviation is large, they're going to be standing further apart. If the standard deviation is small, they're going to be standing closer to you. Let's say on the test that the standard deviation was a 7%. That means your friend over here scored an 87 plus 7, and -7 over here, your friend scored a 73. So now if we look at this, 68% of the population in your class scored between a 73% and an 87%. Now we can go further than one standard deviation. We can go 2 standard deviations. So let's say your third friend said, I scored 2 standard deviations above the mean. So they're at this line up here. So again, that's 87 plus 7. That means you would know that they got a score of 94. Right? 90. It's not letting me draw the 4. There we go. 94. All right. Now here's where they get tricky on the AP exam. Sometimes they'll say within one standard deviation of the mean, what percentage of the population? And you know that it's between these two lines right here and here, and you can say within 68%. If they say it's within 2 standard deviations of the mean, that's 95%. But they might trick you and they might say, you took an exam and you scored 2 standard deviations above the mean. What percentage of the population did you outperform? Now, in this instance, it's not asking how far you are from the mean, it's asking how much better are you than everybody else. So if you're here, how much better are you than everybody else? That's everybody to the left of you. Now we're just going to do some rounding here rather than use the percentage. An easy way to do this is say, what percentage of the population was not better than you? And you could just do this right here, and you could see it's about 2.5%. So that would mean that you are 97.5% better than the rest of the population. So your friend here who scored a 94%, right? They outperformed 97.5% of the class. So they would be way far over to the one side, and maybe one person was better than them, the person who was 3 standard deviations above the mean over here and had nearly a perfect score. All right, so that's what you need to understand in terms of the AP test. Standard curve is one that is symmetrical. The mean and the median are in the middle. The z-scores, +1, -1, those tell you how many standard deviations you are above or below the mean. And if you are within 1 standard deviation of the mean, you're within 68% of the population. If you were within 2 standard deviations of the mean, it's 95% of the population. If you are 1 standard deviation above the mean, you are in the top, where we got 2%, let's say 14%, 16 plus 68, what is that? 84%. You're in the top 84% of the population. If you're 2 standard deviations above the mean, you're almost 98%, 97.5% better than the population. All right, so you need to know, are you within 1, within 2, or are you 1 above, 2 above, 1 below, 2 below, and where everyone else is in relationship to that. So this chart is one you're going to need to memorize as you go through your studying. I hope this was helpful. Again, I can't cover everything in this. A few other things that are a little more advanced that you might want to ask your teacher about at some point could be kurtosis and skewed distributions. Take care.